Today's daf we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf. Hey, this week's learning is sponsored by Jordana Shiur in honor of their son Sadia's marriage to Odell Peretz, wishing them a home full of love, mazal, and Torah values. Okay, we're going to get started now with really what we've been talking about until now, focusing on dinei mamonot b'shlosha. We do judgments relating to monetary law with three people. Today we're going to start dealing with some exceptions. So we're starting with the bottom of Dal Amud, the last few words. Tanu Rabbanan, dinei mamonot b'shlosha. V'im haya mumche l'rabim, dan afilu yechidi. So the Braita starts off and says, just like our Mishnah, dinei mamonot b'shlosha, but as we saw in the Tosefta, for example, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, what do you mean it's five? Now all of a sudden we're going to go to the other extreme in this Braita, and we're going to say, if someone was a specialist, an expert, then, and we're going to talk about this a lot, a mumche, okay, yachid mumche, we're going to call him throughout the Gemara, an individual who's an expert in monetary law, and dan afilu yechidi, they can rule in monetary law cases even on their own. Amar Rav Nachman, so who is considered this dayan yechidi? Now remember Rav Nachman, we talked about him a lot in Bava Batra, how he was, both him and he followed the path of Shmuel, he was the student, one of the main students of Shmuel. Rav Nachman, just like Shmuel, they were considered experts in monetary law. So comes Rav Nachman and says, Kigon Ana, like me, for example, Dan dinei mamonot b'yechidi. I can rule in cases by myself. V'chein Amar Rabbi Chia, and likewise Rabbi Chia said, Kigon Ana Dan dinei mamonot b'yechidi. Now there's something strange about this because Rabbi Chia comes way before Rav Nachman. Okay, he was two generations before Rav Nachman is second generation Amoraim, and Rabbi Chia was exactly the last generation of Tanaim. So it's a little bit strange that he's saying that, what the sugya is first Rav Nachman, then likewise Rabbi Chia said. There's a bunch of different versions of the text and the manuscripts that resolve this issue. It's not in a germane point, so I'm just going to leave it aside for now. But should know there's a bit of a problem here with the text. But either which way, we're getting examples of rabbis who said people like me can rule on their own. Ibayalehu. Now they ask the following question. Kegon ana, digamirna usavirna, unakitna reshuta. Now they're saying three criteria here. Like us, or like someone who is gemirna. Gemir usually means in the halacha, in Gemara, okay, Gemara comes from the language of gemir, usually means we have the tradition. Okay, there's someone who is a good passer down of tradition. That's one of the strengths of some of the rabbis, that they learn from their rabbis who learn from their rabbis, and that's a very important element. So we're gemirna, we're sevirna. Sevirna means you use logic. Okay, you can think about the reasons for things and then apply them. It's not enough to just have the tradition. The tradition often changes as things go, as things change, and you have to think about how to apply things. And nikitna reshuta, and we received permission. Okay, now we're going to learn about this permission. This permission is in Babylonia. It was from the Exilarch, the Reish Galuta, who was considered like a political leader in the area of the Jews, but it was a Jewish political leader who was usually also a Talmid Chacham often. And in Israel, it was the Nasi, right, which was all from, Hillel, the Rabban Gamliel, right? They were all the same family. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel, okay, it was Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel, that's Rabbi Yehuda, all different Rabbi Gamliel's, Rabbi Shimon's, Rabbi Yehuda's, who were all the Nisim. Avalona, so I understand. Someone like that can judge. But avalona kita reshuta dine reshuta dine lo dine. But what if you have the first two? You have the tradition, you have the logic, but you didn't get permission. Do we say dine lo dina? If you rule as an individual, you have everything, you just didn't get the permission, right? It's like what we call, let's say, smicha nowadays or something like that, right? But it's a little bit different, but it's very similar actually. And you didn't get permission. Does that mean that if you ruled, the people don't have to listen to you? You have no authority to rule? O dilma afagav delona reshuta dine dine. Or do we say no? If you're a yachid mumche, it would work. It would be effective, even if you didn't get permission. So let's figure it out. Tashma, let's learn from the following story. Marzutra bereid Rav Nachman. Okay, so now Marzutra, the son of Rav Nachman, dan dina v'ta'ah. The way we're going to figure this out is by understanding what the responsibility of a judge is when they make a mistake. Now, usually if a judge makes a mistake in dinei mamonot, if they were an appointed judge, they have immunity. They don't have to compensate the person for the loss they caused, because that's their protection as being judges. So here Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, ruled in the case and made a mistake. So the question is, did he have to pay back the money or not? Until the Kamed to Rav Yosef. He goes before Rav Yosef to find out. This is third generation Amoraim, because it's the son of Rav Nachman. Goes before Rav Yosef, one of the main leaders of that generation. Amar le, im kablu chalayhu lo tishalem, v'ilo zil shalem. Rav Yosef says it really depends. When you went to judge these people and they accepted you as their judge, did they say we're accepting and you don't have to take financial responsibility for judging, for ruling in our case? Or did they not say that? They were all of a sudden learning that there were all sorts of ways to do judgments, and it wasn't as clear cut as you go to a court and you get ruled. But you could, right? We saw certain dina mamonot like haldaot and halvaot you could do in front of three regular people who aren't necessarily judges. Here we have a case where Yachid Mumche, he was a Yachid Mumche, but it's obvious he wasn't appointed. If he was appointed, then for sure he would be not held responsible. What's the point of being appointed if not to exonerate you in case, right? To protect you. It's like your insurance policy that you don't have to pay if you cause a mistake to be made. But here it was clear he didn't have that reshut, because if he had that reshut, this wouldn't be an issue. So it must be he didn't have reshut. And comes Rav Yosef and says, well, whether or not you have to pay depends on whether the people accepted you to rule and said, we accept your ruling even if you make a mistake. Or did they not say that? If they didn't say that, right? Ilo zil shalem. If not, then you have to pay. So what do you learn from here? Well, Shema Mina, now there's two issues going on. One is, do you have to compensate if you made a mistake? So that we said, right, if you don't have reshut, then it depends on whether they accepted, it depends what the two sides agreed with the judge when he went to judge them. But it never says here that his ruling isn't a ruling. It's obvious that his ruling was a ruling, and therefore, Shema Mina, ki lo nakit reshuta dine dina Shema Mina. The whole thing about the paying was just, we brought this up, it wasn't the main point. The main point was, if you weren't appointed, which is obvious he wasn't appointed from Rav Yosef's answer to him about are you responsible to pay or not. And since it's obvious he wasn't appointed, and yet it's also obvious from here that whatever he ruled is effective and they have to listen to it because that wasn't the question asked. It was taken as a given that the ruling was accepted. So now you see that even without reshut, as long as you're gabirna v'savirna, you have the tradition and you know how to think properly and apply the halacha, then your ruling is a ruling and it's effective. So now we're going to talk about this accepting this, having reshut, okay? The reshut with the authority of the Reish Galuta or the Nasi in Israel, what it gives you is the ability to be exempt if you made a mistake. So Amarav, Haiman debai lemeid andina, ve'ita mibai lemiftal, lishko reshuta mibei Reish Galuta. So comes Rav and he says, listen, if you want to be a judge and you want to be protected from making a mistake and from having to pay, Lishko Rishuta mi Reish Galuta, go to the Reish Galuta, the Exilarch, and get permission, and that will exempt you. And Chanamar Shmuel, Lishko Rishuta mi Reish Galuta. And Shmuel said the exact same thing as Rav. And this was the advice they gave people who wanted to rule and not have to be liable. You can imagine, right? Like you're writing in the chat, malpractice insurance and all that, right? This is the way to protect you in case a mistake was made. Already, like I said, we're seeing at the beginning of the Masechet, right? We both started with this issue of the rabbis having the power to override Torah law when they saw fit. And we're also getting to another big issue, which is really at the crux of the Masechet, which is, in the end, the judges are human and humans make mistakes. So even though we talked about the first class, this is a godly kind of court, but it's not in the end. In the end, it really is given to humans, and humans can make mistakes as well. So how do we handle that, right? We're kind of getting off on the side issue, which wasn't the main topic of our shiur for today. It's really about these exceptions to the rule of the three judges, but from that, we're going to talk about mistakes. Now we're going to learn about this Reish Galuta, the Exilarch, and also the Nasi in Israel. So we have these two central places. Now, we're around the first generation, or at least the Rav and Shmuel were. Okay, we're not sure. This is the Stama de Gemara. We don't know who's speaking now in this next statement and what generation is happening in. And that's could be very important. But if we start talking about history, in the time of the Tanaim, Israel was the center. That's where the main things were. There were some Babylonians, but most of them were in Israel. In fact, there's even Babylonians who come to Israel and learn there. But we're going to see actually the story today. Rav goes down to Babylonia and he sets up a big yeshiva there. And from there, the center starts to shift a little bit. And more students start coming to Babylonia. And from there, it really develops into the end, right? By the time we get to the end of the Gemara time period, there aren't even a lot of Jews in Israel. The Jerusalem Talmud, also called the Palestinian Talmud, ends before, okay? At least 100 years, maybe 150, it's not clear, before the Babylonian Talmud finishes. And because things aren't good there, and eventually it entirely shifts to Babylonia. Now, we don't know at what point we are in this range of time, okay, from, let's say, 200 to, I forget, I think it's 219, I think Rav goes to Babylonia, and then till around 500 when the Gemara is kind of finished, and then also the Gemara develops after that, this Sforaim, which kind of, and their text ends up in here till around the year 800. But at the beginning of that time period, we have Israel trying to hold its dominion and saying, well, we can only determine the months and the years, and when we do leap years and the calendars, our authority. And they start talking about burial in Israel. This is so important. That's when it becomes very central because they want to keep their hold. But the Babylonians are pulling, and there becomes this political struggle. So if you think about the sugya in the context of that, it's very interesting. So the Gemara says, Pshita, it's obvious. And we're going to basically bring three things that are obvious and one thing that we're going to ask about. Pshita mehacha lahacha, if you're here, which is Babylonia, because we're in the Babylonian Talmud, if you're here and you get authority by the Reish Galuta, and then you rule here in Babylonia, obviously, right, the authority of the Reish Galuta clearly extends to Babylonia. That's not a question. And therefore, you'll be exempt. Mehatam lahatam mehane, and if you're in Israel and you get permission from the Nasi, then you obviously have permission in all of Israel to rule. And again, if you make a mistake, you won't have to pay. But, and also, mehacha lahata, and this is the premise of our sugya here, that clearly the Babylonian ruler has more power than the Israel ruler, because if you get authority from here, from the Reish Galuta, and you go there to Eretz Israel, and you rule Nami Mahane, it also obviously is going to be effective. Right now, why is it so obvious? Well, first of all, they're in Babylonia, and they thought that their authority was more powerful, and here they prove it from a pasuk and a braita. Mehane, dahacha shevet, vahacha mechokek. Because here we are called shevet, and there the ruler is called shevet, and there the ruler is called a mechokek. Okay, let's define these words, and we'll see as they say in the Braita, as they define them, Keditanya, as it says in the Braita, lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda. Now, both of them, by the way, were from they were taken from and I think the Reish Galuta was also Davidic, if I remember correctly. But they're saying like this, Lo yashur shevet mi Yehuda umechokek mi bein raglav. This is from Vayechi, we'll read in a few weeks, the brachot that Yaakov gives to Yehuda. And he says the shevet won't leave from Yehuda. What is that? Elu rashei galuyot shebebavel, right? They're also from Yehuda. Yeah, I was right. They are from Yehuda, clearly. These are the heads of the Golah, the Exilarchs, that are from Yehuda, and they're in Babylonia, though. The Shevet is in Babylonia. This is the drasha. Okay, it certainly doesn't say that in the simple reading of the pasuk. Sherodinit Israel b'Shevet. They rule the Jewish people, right? The way we might say with an iron fist, right? They have a Shevet, which is like I'm trying to think of the word, but what's I don't know if someone can help me. A scepter. Yeah, thank you. With the scepter. Okay, very harshly. So it means they have a lot of power. Mechokek mi bein raglav. Now, a mechokek is a legislator. A legislator doesn't usually have a huge amount of authority. I mean, they have authority to be a legislator, but they're not like the scary people who go around with a stick or something beating people up. Elu b'nei banav shel Hillel. These are the grandchildren of Hillel. Shemelamdim Torah b'rabim. They teach Torah in public. They're great leaders, but they're not as strong as we are. So therefore, for sure, if you get authority in Babylonia and you go to Israel, you will have the authority to rule. And if you make a mistake, you won't have to pay. However, mehatam lahachamai. The question is, remember, this started with a pshita. This is obvious, and this is obvious, and this is obvious. But we have a question about what if you got authority from Israel? And then you came to Babylonia, which was where the direction a lot of people were moving. Are you exempt from paying if you make a mistake? Tashma, you can see why this is all about exerting authority, right? The Babylonians wanted to control who was ruling in their country. So Tashma, let's learn from here. Did Rabba bar Hana, who we're going to learn that when he left Israel, he got permission. We're going to see that Rabbi Chia, his uncle, asked for permission from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and said, "Can my nephew Rabba bar Hana rule in Israel?" Or the truth is, no. He was leaving Israel. Okay, so he said, "Can he rule?" Okay, and he got permission. We'll see the whole story in a bit. Just want to kind of set it up so you understand what we're talking about here. So Rabba bar Hana, by the way, most people think this is not Rabba bar Hana. There's a Rabba bar Hana who's the grandson of Hana. Hana, by the way, is not a woman's name. It's a man's name here. And they say this is someone else. Okay, it's a little bit less known. Rabba bar Hana dan dina vita'a. So he ruled on a case in Babylonia and he made a mistake. So what happened? Ata likame de Rabbi Chia. Amarle, so he goes before Rabbi Chia, and he says to him, "I kabluch alayhu lo tishalem, v'ilo zil shlem." So what happened? He had a case. He made a mistake. He went before Rabbi Chia, his uncle, and he said, "What am I supposed to do? Do I have to compensate them?" And Rabbi Chia said, right, and the story is, he got authority to rule in Babylonia, in Israel, came to Babylonia, and let's see what happened. So Rabbi Chia says to him, "Listen, it all depends on what, whether with the two people you were ruling, whether you were judging their case, whether they accepted you to not assume responsibility or not. Meaning, what you got from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi doesn't help you here in terms of not having to compensate the other side. It all depends. It's as if you didn't have any authority to rule here." So right? So if they accepted you on as their judge without responsibility at all, then you won't have to pay. But if they didn't specifically say that and they just accepted you to judge without saying, "We're going to exempt you if you make a mistake," then you have to pay. And in case you didn't know, I told you this, but Rabba bar Hana rishut havanakid, he already got permission to rule. Shma mina mehatam lahachalo mahane shma mina. So now we learn that it obviously doesn't work. Now we're going to ask the question later, then why did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi give him permission if it wasn't going to help him anyway? That's a good question. But first they're going to ask a question from, not to get confused, from another Raba, but this is Raba bar Rav Huna, Raba the son of Rav Huna. So they're going to ask, Velo mahane, wait a minute. Authority from Israel, getting permission in Israel doesn't help you in Babylonia to exempt you? Here's a case of Rabba bar Rav Huna, ki avu minse bahade de Reish Galuta. Sometimes you would get into arguments with the house of the Reish Galuta. They were known to be, right, even though usually it was often someone who was a knowledgeable person in halacha, but they were also political leaders, and there was always politics associated with it. He had people who were thugs who would do like some dirty work for him, and it wasn't it was very wealthy. We've seen lots of parties that are going on there, and it wasn't exactly all perfect there. So he would get into some kind of clashes with the people in the house of the Reish Galuta, and he would say to them, to basically say, now, what's the issue? The issue is that the Reish Galuta, as the political head, okay, we all know how politics work, and they would exert their authority by saying, "Look, we're the Reish Galuta, you're subjugated to us. Like, we're in charge here, and you have to be beholden to us." So he would say to them, when they would do things like that, he would say to them the following: "I don't owe you anything. I can rule independently of you. Lav minaychu Nikita Rishuta. I don't have permission from you to rule. Where does my permission come from? Nikita Rishuta me Abba Mari. I got it from my father, Rav Huna. Abba Mari me Rav. My father got it from Rav. Rav me Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia me Rabbi. In other words, my tradition of who I have authority to rule from. This is interesting. It's not like he received authority from Rabbi in Israel, but basically he said, my authority goes back to Israel. Okay, if you trace it, and the way my tradition goes, it's all from Rebbe. So I'm not beholden to you at all. So you could say whatever you want. I've got my own. I'm on a different track. And what do you see here? It sounds like authority, right? Getting permission from Israel would be effective in Babylonia, from what he said. Here's a great response. The Gemara says, "B'milta da'almu hu da'okim lahu." These were just words alone. This didn't mean anything. He was just trying to, they were being bullies. He was bullying them back. He was trying to say, "Oh, I'm not beholden to you." But in fact, he was. And in fact, right? It was kind of meaningless what he said. He was just hoping that maybe they wouldn't realize and they would take him seriously. But we often say things that don't really have meaning, but it's a way of us attempting to exert our authority, even if really legally it doesn't really mean very much. Now we want to go back to Raba bar Hana. So that was a side story. That was just a question. Is it really true that if you get authority to rule in Israel, it doesn't help you in Babylonia? And in fact, it seems like it's not effective. So now we get to the basic question. Well, if so, and again, we didn't see the story yet, but we're going to see that when Rebbe gave authority to Raba bar Hana, he did it when he was on his way out of Israel, heading to Babylonia. So the obvious question is, if it wasn't really effective for anything, then Raba bar Hana reshuta dinaket lamale. Why did he get permission to rule if it wasn't going to help him at all? To which the answer, la'ayarot ha'umdim ala gvulin. He did have authority to rule in the places right outside of Israel. Now, if you think about it, right, he was leaving Israel, going to Babylonia. I'll give you just to kind of, my husband always likes to say this. He looked up once where Pumbedita, for example, one of the main cities in Babylonia, is now in modern day Iraq city called Fallujah. And he looked up on Google Maps, how long does it take? 9 hours drive to get there. It's not really so far, just to give you kind of perspective of now, obviously in those days, it was a lot longer than 9 days. They didn't have cars, but still not so far. But, and the trek that they would do, right? One of the things when the Syrian border now thing happened, he said, maybe we could get to Fallujah now, and go on a trip to go see Pumbedita. So basically the trek, right? You would go through Syria and you would go, and travel. And on the way, right? What's the issue? In Babylonia, you don't have authority, but the cities that are close to Israel, he had authority. And think about it, those cities didn't have a lot of rabbis. So what he was giving him authority was to rule on his way, on his trek to get to Babylonia in other places, but not in Babylonia. And that's what they say this was all for. Even though it seems like it was also just so that he had some sort of, as we call, smicha. Now, even if it wasn't fully going to exempt him when he got to Babylonia and ruled, and he would still have to maybe pay, but it was also good just to know that he had kind of a document in hand, or I don't know what, but a tradition that he had gotten permission from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So it is effective for other things as well, but they seem to say it was really more for on the way. So now they say my reshuta. So what is this reshut he got, and what's the background story? So Kiavanachi Raba bar Hana leBavel. Here we get the story. As he was about to leave Israel, going to Babylonia, Amar le Rabbi Chia, who we're going to see in a second, is his uncle. Rabbi Chia says to Rebbe, Ben Achi Yored leBavel, my nephew. So here you're going to see now, it wasn't like Rebbe says, okay, these are the greatest rabbis of our generation, I'm going to give them authority. It's that you would go and say, listen, I want to have authority to rule. And here even the uncle does it for him and says, listen, goes to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he says, my nephew, Ben Achi Yored leBavel, the son of my brother, is going to Babylonia. Amar le Rabbi Chia le Rebbe, Yoreh, can he teach? Yoreh, yes, he can teach there. Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, yes, he can judge. We're going to see the difference between Yadin and Yadin is usually Dine Mamonot. Yoreh is Dine Isur Veheter. You can teach like about kashrus and other things like that. Taharot. Yatir Bechorot, can he permit firstborns? Okay, what is this? It says firstborn animals. Firstborn animals have to be given to the Kohen. Okay, they're sanctified from birth. They go to the Kohen. We're going to have a whole Masechet Bechorot. We'll learn a lot about this in a little while. Then they go to the Kohen. The Kohen has to sacrifice them unless they get a blemish. And then once this Kohen sacrifices it in the temple, the Kohen can eat the meat, and some gets burned, the rest not. Now, the rest he can eat. If it has a blemish, which is a permanent blemish, then the Kohen can eat it without having to sacrifice it, which is obviously much easier. Now, if you're talking in the time of Rav and Raba bar Hana, well, then at this point there is no temple anymore. And there, we're going to learn this in also Masechet Bechorot, it was a big problem because all the firstborn animals the Kohanim would get, they couldn't eat until a blemish. Like they could wait until there's some Mishna I remember we talked about, it was like really old, the animal, they're still waiting for this blemish to happen so they can eat the animal. So there was a whole, miktsua, like a profession, called a rabbi who can tell whether the blemish is a permanent blemish, not a permanent blemish. Again, if it's permanent, then the Kohen can eat it right away, just slaughter it, which is obviously what you're looking for. So can he have permission latir b'cholot? And he says, yes, you can. Now we're going to have a parallel story. Around the same time, it seems, Rav was also going to Babylonia. Amar le Rabbi Chia le Rabbi, same story, except with two differences, and the two differences we're going to talk about. So Rabbi Chia says to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Ben achuti yoreh leBavel. Rav was also his nephew, but nephew from his sister. The son of my sister is going to Babylonia, as opposed to the son of my brother. Yoreh, right? Can he rule? Yes, he can rule. Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, yes, he can judge. Yatir b'cholot, can he permit firstborns? Al yatir, no, he can't. It's a little strange, right? If I asked you, Raba bar Hana, who do you know about Rav? You don't know about Raba bar Hana. Where the Raba bar Hana got more rights to do things than Rav? That's going to be our second question. Why? But first, they're going to ask the other question, which just seems like a strange question. Mishna lamar dekare ben achiu, Mishna lamar dekare ben achoti. Why was he called the son of my brother, and he was called the son of my sister, of his sister, right? He was Rabbi Chia's son of his brother, and he was called the son of my sister. Okay, well, if you're going to say, well, that's because he was the brother of his brother, the son of his brother, and he was the son of his sister. In other words, isn't that obvious? Why are you even asking this question? Well, you'll see why they're asking the question, because V'ha Marmar, it was said, Ivu, who was Rab's father, Hana, okay, who was Rabba bar Hana's father, V'shila v'marta v'Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia, okay, and these other two, Kulu b'nei Abba bar Acha Karsala mikafri havu. They all had the same father, meaning that Rav, who was the son of Ivu, was also the son of his brother. So they were both the son of his brothers. Rabbi Chia had two brothers that are relevant for the story. One is Hana, one is Ivu. Okay, if you look in the Quran, they have a good picture of the whole family genealogy. You'll see why you need it in a minute because it gets a little confusing. So now it really becomes a big question. Why did he say it's the son of my sister when it was really the son of his brother? To which the Gemara asks, Rav Barachua Dehave Bar Achte. He was the son of his brother, who was also the son of his sister. Sounds a little strange. That would mean that brother and sister married each other? No. What happened was that, and by the way, and Rabba bar Hana was Baruch de Lav bar Achte. In other words, one was both right? Rabba bar Hana was only the son of his brother, but Rav was the son of both his sister and his brother. How is that? So Rabbi Chia was the son of two parents who were in a second marriage. Okay, so it's very simple. The brother from the first marriage, okay, the chart's helpful, but the truth is it's pretty simple. Think about it like this. Rabbi Chia was a son born to a father who had already had children with a different wife, and that was Ivu was one of the brothers, and Rabbi Chia was one of the brothers. Ivu was one of the brothers, and Hana was one of the brothers. Okay, so Ivu, one of the brothers, married Rabbi Chia's sister, who his mother had from a different marriage. So his mother and father were both in second marriages, and basically, it's a stepsister and stepbrother married each other, but they don't share the same parent. Rabbi Chia shared a parent with each one of them. Okay? Not so complicated. Ibait Ema, second option, turning out Amabet, maybe he called him Ben Achoti, right? And then we're just distinguishing that he was Ben Achoti because he was also Ben Ach and Ben Achot. Okay, it was both. But maybe Hashem Chochmato, because he was much smarter. Dichtiv amor lechochma achotiat. Okay, this pasuk in Mishlei that says, say to wisdom that she's your sister. So sister goes with wisdom. And since Rav was wiser, he wanted to distinguish them, and he said, the son of my sister. Now, the commentaries say this doesn't mean they disagree with the genealogy. The genealogy was the genealogy. He was also the son of his sister, but he was also the son of his brother. And he could have called him the son of his brother. And the reason he called the son of the sister was because of this. Okay, so again, just to clarify, Rabbi Chia's stepsister married Rabbi Chia's half-brother married Rabbi Chia's half-sister. And the two people who married each other, though, were step-sister and brother, okay? Not half-brother and sister. Because half-brother and sister is obviously not permitted. But Rabbi Chia was the connection between the two, because it was each, right? For him, it was each half-siblings to him. Okay. Yatir b'cholot al yatir. Now we have to get back to the question, why was Rav not allowed to, especially if he gave permission to Rabba bar Hana, how could he not give permission to Rav to allow b'cholot? So for this, we'll have two answers. My time, what's the reason? Ilema, if you're going to say, which usually they're going to reject, mishum de lo chakim, if you say he wasn't smart enough to do it, well, hakam rinan de chakim tuva. We already said, and we're l'chochma chotiat. He was smarter, so can't say that. You could be smart, but it doesn't necessarily mean you know everything. Maybe he wasn't an expert in mumim, in blemishes. That's also not true. Because Ha'amar Rav, 18 chodashim gadalti etza ro'eh behema. For 18 months, I lived with a shepherd. Leida ezemum kavua ve'ezemum over. He did like a specialty, a fellowship with a ro'eh behema, just to be able to learn how to do mumim. So he actually was a real expert. So now he begs the question, why didn't he give him permission to do this? So two possible reasons. Again, we learn this daf has a bunch of other things that you learn besides the content of the daf, but side things. Ela lachlok lo kavod leRabba bar Hana. Rabbi Yehuda was concerned. His two nephews are going to, and this is why it seems like it was clear they were going around the same time, and maybe even they went together, not clear. But when he goes to get responsible, right, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is giving them authority to rule and to do different things, he realizes already what's going to happen. That Rav is going to get to Babylonia, and so is Rabba bar Hana. Rabba bar Hana is going to want to rule, but everybody's going to see Rav's greatness. And Rabba bar Hana, as usual, the immigrant, the new guy on the block, they're not going to take him seriously, especially because he pales in comparison to Rav. And he wanted people to give respect to Rabba bar Hana. We already saw some stories about, the new guy comes to town and is really made fun of and mocked, and nobody takes him seriously. They don't really believe that he really knows what he's doing. So basically, we're concerned. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sees that he's concerned about that. So he says, you know what I'll do? I'll give Rav less authority. And then people will say, oh, Rabba bar Hana, if he has more authority to do things that Rav doesn't, he must be great also in his own right. And that was a way to gain him respect. A different option is, totally different option, mishum hagufe. Maybe exactly for the reason that we said. Maybe because Rav was such an expert in mumim, we don't want to give him authority to rule. Why would that be? Sometimes knowing too much is hazardous. Rav bekia b'mumim mitvei. He knew them very well. V'shari mumi de lo yadei nashi. He's going to look at blemishes that people aren't familiar with, and he's going to say, oh, that's a blemish, that's a permanent blemish, and this animal can be eaten. What will happen? Amre, and this is going to be a theme of the next section of the Gemara, about people making mistakes when rabbis say things. Amre ki agav nashari Rav atu lemishrei mum over. They're going to see what Rav saw. They're going to not really identify the difference between that and a different one. They'll think that they'll see another blemish, which is actually a passing blemish, which doesn't allow you, because the blemish is going to go away, doesn't allow you to eat the animal. And they're going to think, because he's so careful, he can just differentiate between a little teeny difference. They're not going to see that small difference. They're going to rule in other cases and say, oh, it's fine, and we can eat these animals. And therefore, it's dangerous to allow someone who knows so much, that knows how to permit, because of the danger of how people will view this. And that's something we see all the time, about finding that fine balance between wanting to have rabbis who permit things and yet concerned that people will take it to the wrong place and maybe make mistakes about things. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not want to give him authority to do that. So it's one of two reasons. Okay, those are the answers. Now we're going to get to the next section, which is Yoreh. So now he says to him, Yoreh, right? So can he rule? Yes, he can rule. Now, so we had Yadin, which is rule in a court. And then we have Yoreh, which is really to teach. It's not to rule, it's to teach. He can teach halachot, like what is tameh, what is tahor, right? All different things, what's kosher, what's not kosher. So, Gamir, Reshut Lama Mishka. Well, this isn't a case of causing a financial loss to someone. In other words, what was the whole point of getting permission? The permission was what we learned already in the beginning of the daf, that the permission was just to prevent, if you made a mistake in a ruling and you caused someone to pay money for no reason, you don't have to compensate them, your malpractice insurance. But you don't have that when it comes to Isser v'heter, Tumah v'tara. Now, one could claim that maybe you do, because if you say the food's not kosher, you have to throw it out, and it turns out you were wrong, so you caused a financial loss. But it's a bit of a different financial loss, and seems to be not relating to that. So then what was the point of getting reshut? To which they answer, Mishum Ma'aseh Shaya. Well, because of a case that happened. And again, this is where you see the rabbi's authority that when cases come before them and they see something that happens, they have the power to change things around a little bit. So theoretically, you didn't really need this, but because of the following situation, again, relating to mistakes being made, they decided that people should have permission also just to teach. Again, we don't mean teach like teach in a class, like teach a Tanakh class or teach even a Gemara class, but to teach practical halacha is dangerous. Again, what happened in the story? Tanya, as it says in a bright, so Rebbe went to a certain place. He saw people whose hands were impure, and they were kneading dough with their impure hands, making the doughs impure. And people in those days wanted to keep everything in purity, level of purity. So he goes over to the people. Your hands are impure and you're kneading the dough. And what's the issue? Remember how it works with tuma? In order for something to contract impurity, it has to have had a liquid come upon it. Dough usually has water, something that's one of the 7 liquids that makes something susceptible to impurity. And then if your hands touch it after the water gets on it, then your hands can make it impure. So he says, what are you doing? Amrulo, they said to him, there was a student here who came. He taught us that water from swamps is not one of the 7 mashkim. And they took water from swamps, like from these lakes or something, and they were using that as for kneading their dough. But what was the problem? He didn't say me b'tzaim. He said v'hu me beitzim darish lehu. He said the liquid from the egg. In other words, when you beat an egg, we all know it's liquidy. If you use an egg to knead your dough and without any water, it's not susceptible to impurity. But beitzim, bitzaim sounds very similar, and he wasn't clear in his enunciation, and they all misunderstood him. Ve'inu savor mebitzaim kamar. They thought he said mebitzaim, so they started kneading their dough with mebitzaim. And not only because they misheard him, but they also thought logically that this would be okay. So yeah, I agree with you. Swamp water sounds disgusting. Some people claim that it's like from a lake. It doesn't necessarily mean it was dirty water. Like swamp water has this negative connotation. It could have been clean water. It's like kind of water from rainwater that's gathered up together. So they thought maybe it's same kamar. Vitau nami bahan. They also thought the following, because may karyon and may pega psulim. So these are bodies of water that you can't take the water from here, and it's kind of like the mebitzaim. These are specifically names of bodies of water, karyon and piga. And in the halacha about making the para aduma waters, it's called mechatat, which is mixed with the ashes of the para aduma, and you take water. Well, you can't use the mei karyon and mei pega, because they are mebitzaim, because they fall into this category. So what did these people say? Well, they thought he said mebitzaim, and they thought the following. Well, they thought, since you can't use this water for the mechatap, for the paraduma waters, it's used to make people pure who are impure, they thought the two go hand in hand, that they also don't create susceptibility to impurity. Velohi, but it's not true. You need fresh water, that's streaming water. But when it comes to lachshir, any kind of water is fine. It doesn't have to be particular kind of water. And therefore, they made this connection, which wasn't really a connection at all, because those are two very different things. And therefore, Tana, a different Braita says, Bo'otasha agazru, at that moment when Rebbe saw this mistake they made, Tamid al yoreh elen kenotel rishumei rabo. Now, it's interesting, Rebbe was there when this happened, and he was the same one who gave them the permission. At that point, they learned that in order to teach, you have to get permission, because the rabbi has to check, are you clear? Number one, do you enunciate your words clearly? And number two, do you make yourself clear, right? Some people just can't explain themselves well, and that also causes mistakes. Okay. Another story about teaching. We're going to get a little bit off topic now, but it's also about the idea of lehorot, and it's a different halacha about teaching and when you can or can't teach. So Tanchum Bereder Rabbi Ami Ikla lechatar. He got to this place called Chatar, which seems to be in Lebanon, because we'll see in a minute they're going to talk about Tzur, which is also a city in Lebanon. Darish lehu mutar lutot chitim bepesach. So we get to this place and he teaches them, you can silk your grains of wheat on Pesach before you turn them into matzah or anything, even though maybe it will cause, you could see that maybe it would cause them to lachmitz, to leaven, but no, it's okay. You don't have to worry about it when they're dry. Right? They would do this to get the shell off. Amrulao, lav Rabbi Mani de Tzur ikahacha. So they said to him, isn't Rabbi Mani from Tzur here? Vitanya, and therefore, isn't he around here? And there's a bright that says, Talmid al yorei alachabim kom rabo elim kanei arachot mimena shalosh parsaot. So Tanchum was a student of Rabbi Mani, and Rabbi Mani was in the vicinity, and they said, you're not allowed to teach a halacha if your rabbi's in the vicinity. It's not respectful. This is a totally different issue. This just has to do with respect for your rabbi. So if he's within 3 parsaot, why 3 parsaot? Keneged Machane Yisrael. That was the length of the camp where they camped in the desert. Amar lahu. So what does he say? Then why did I teach this even though my rabbi was in town? Lavadatai. I didn't know he was around. Okay, nobody told me. There was no message up. Rabbis in town don't teach. I didn't know, and therefore I taught. Okay, another story which seems not necessarily really connected. And Rashi gives 2 possible explanations why it's here. Maybe we'll just go do the first one. Rabbi Chia chazi lahu gavra. Rabbi Chia sees someone to have a kai bebeit hakvarot. He's in a cemetery. Amarle, lav ben ish ploni kohen ata. Aren't you the son of so-and-so the kohen? What are you doing in a cemetery? Okay, so why is it, first of all, either this is similar to what the Rebbe story, where Rebbe comes and says, why are you kneading your dough, betuma? And here Rabbi Chia comes and says, why are you doing this? Some people say it's like the previous story, even though it doesn't say so. He was teaching this in front of his rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was around, okay? And that maybe has to do with the previous story about teaching in front of your rabbi, and we'll talk about that in one more second if you go with that's the first explanation in Rashi. So now the person says, you're right, my father's a Kohen, but he followed after his eyes, okay, meaning his eyes would look around. He saw this woman, he found this divorcee. He fell in love with her, he married her, and I was born from that union. And a Kohen who marries a divorcee, the son is a halal, and therefore I'm not a Kohen anymore, and therefore I'm in the Beit Farber because I'm not even a Kohen. Okay, and therefore he says, now here, he was actually wrong in what he saw, so it's different from the previous story where Rebbe was actually right in saying that people were wrong. What they say is if you do say that this was in front of his rabbi and his rabbi was in town, you say that this is different. To teach something like what is the halacha, you can't do when your rabbi's around. But you can stop someone from doing something that they're doing that's wrong. Now, in the end, he was wrong about it. He actually was right, but he thought this person was doing something wrong, and therefore you went to stop him, and that you're allowed to do even if your rab's in town. That's one possibility that Rashi brings. Okay, moving on. Pshita lepalga haka de mahani. Now we're back to getting authority to rule, and then if you make a mistake, you don't have to pay. So we understand that if you do it lepalga, if you do partial, okay, like Rav, who had reshut to rule, but not on Bechorot, for example. So clearly it's effective. But al tnaima, what if you're given it conditionally? Like you can do it for the next 3 years and that's it. So does that mean, for those 3 years, really, you're not responsible if you make a mistake? Tashma, let's learn it from here. The Amarle Rabbi Yochanan le Rav Shaman, Hare atabi reshutenu ad shetavo atzleinu. You're under our authority, meaning we'll protect you until you come back. Okay, this sounds like someone's going on shlichut, and while they're on shlichut, they can do things that maybe they can't do where they live, but they have the authority to do it because they're being sent out to, some other place that needs them or something like that. But it seems like this was something people did, and it seems like it was valid. Now we're going to go to something else. So we mentioned in the previous, I think it was on Daf, was it Daf Dalet? No, Gimel, actually. On Daf Gimel, we had this other halakha. So we started our daf just to review a little bit, and then we'll finish up. Dina moment up with shlosha, however, yachid mumche works, right? That's exception number 1. And then we had a whole discussion. When are you responsible to pay? When not? What is the authority? If they give you what's a yachid mumche with authority, with permission? What's a yachid mumche that doesn't have permission? We talked about Israel, Babylonia. We talked about, a bunch of other issues that came up. And we talked about the Bechorot and why, the whole Rav and Rabba bar Hana story. Now we're going to get to this statement that Shmuel makes, another exception to the rule of dinim amar b'shlosha. Amar Shmuel, shnayim shedanu dinehem din, ela shenikra beit din chatzuf. If 2 people judge the case, it's effective, even though they're called a Beit Din Chatzuf. It's audacity of them to think that they could do this. It's not appropriate, but if they did it, it's a valid law, a valid ruling. People have to keep to it. So, Yativ Rav Nachman b'Karmel lahashmata. Now, Rav Nachman, who was a big student of Shmuel, right, the main student of Shmuel, comes and teaches Shmuel's ruling. Eitive Rava l'Rav Nachman. Rava starts shooting questions at him. We're going to get through the first one today. Afilu shnayim is a kimo shnayim mechavim. We won't actually finish it, but we're going to get started on it. The Mishnah on Daf Kaftet says, even if two say the person's innocent, or shnayim mechavim, or two people say the person's guilty, ve'echad omer eini yodea, and the third one says, I don't know. Like, I'm sitting out on this one. I'm not ruling either which way. Yosifu hadayanim. You have to add more judges. You can't have a case like this where only two people rule. And that's, you can have two people say you're obligated and one says you're not. That works. But if the third guy says, I don't know, and kind of leaves the picture, you can't do that. If Shmuel's right, what we said, it should work. So the answer says, shane hatam, demeikara adata detlate yative, hachalav adata detlate yative. Says, there, they went, in the case in the Mishnah, it says, three people went to rule, and then one left. Then you have to add dayanim. But if we started with two, in Shmuel's case, you only started with two, shnayim shedanu, dinaim din, it's effective. So two isn't effective when you start with three. But if you start with two, it is effective. Okay, so I was wrong before. We actually are going to finish the first question. It's the second one that we're going to stop in the middle. Eitive, second question. We're going to talk about pshara tomorrow, very fascinating mediation. Okay, mediation also comes up here in the Gemara. So if you have a judgment, it has to happen with three. That's judges rule a case. But if you go for mediation, it's only two. And there's something stronger about mediation than there is about judgment, which is if two people rule, the people don't have to keep what they do because judgment's supposed to be with three. That seems to go directly against Shmuel. But if two people do a mediation, two judges or two people enact a mediation, and they're ruling in a mediation case, then the people have to accept their ruling. So you see here that Shnaim Shadinu Ein Dinaim Din against Shmuel. So I'll have to resolve that tomorrow. And with that, we're going to finish. So like I said, today was all about exceptions to this rule of Dinei Mamonot B'Shlosha, which we thought was so obvious. First, we learned previously on a different daf that Rabbi says it's 5, not even 3. And today we start learning that maybe 1 is okay if it's a Yachim Mumche, or if it's not, 2 could be sufficient. At least according to Shmuel, we're going to see Rabbi Abba who comes and disagrees with him in tomorrow's daf. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.